Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Sunday Morning Live. This is your host, Aaron Tomlinson. Been doing a series on spiritual gifts during this season, this holiday season. Hope everybody, if you celebrated Christmas, had a great Christmas. If you celebrate other holidays, I hope that they were wonderful for you as well. And let me just make sure I'm showing up in the right places. Let me share this a couple places, give it a minute to breathe, let some people jump on. And we'll jump into today. We're going to talk about prophecy. We're going to talk about I've been talking about that with the spiritual gifts, but I want to do at least one more talk on prophecy, tying it in with altered states of consciousness and what some people might call the intuitive ways of knowing, but I think the noetic ways of knowing is a more accurate term. I'll explain that in a minute. But again, I want to just check some things. And like I said, give people some time to jump on. Hope everybody's doing well. If you're watching by replay, let me know. Just want to see something really fast. All right, looks like I'm on. Okay, so let's jump into this. So I've been using scripture as a way to explore and talk about spiritual gifts. That may seem strange if you followed me for some time. It might appear to you that I've pivoted if you haven't watched a video and you're just jumping back in for the first time in a while. I've really pivoted. I started last summer sort of pivoting away from just focused on deconstruction, religious trauma, things like that. As a result of my own personal evolution and things that have occurred with me and happened in my own life. And so now I'm more focused on just spirituality. I see tremendous value in spirituality, but not just spirituality, not just any kind of spirituality, but specifically relational spirituality. So in 2026, as we're looking to the new year and as we're going forward, I'm going to be talking more and more and more about relational spirituality, coming back to some of the foundations of the gospel, and really have become of the mindset that a lot of deconstruction has become very extremely toxic. It's the same sort of spirit, if you will, that a lot of fundamentalist religion has. A lot of people in the deconstruction community have become fundamentalist about deconstruction. And it's just fascinating to watch that. I'm thankful for my deconstruction time period. I'm thankful for the freedom that it brought. I'm thankful for the healing that it brought into my life. But it got out of balance for me. And so my focus has really shifted now towards helping people to heal, helping people to discover healthy spirituality. And like I said, relational spirituality. And didn't really intend on doing a whole series on spiritual gifts. But alas, here we are. I think this is the fourth or fifth one that I've done. And I'll probably do a few more. I think it's an important topic. We're looking at it from scripture, because if you were to type in, and I did this, I typed in spiritual gifts into a Google search, into AI, into YouTube searches, and everything that came up was Christian based and Christian oriented. Most of it evangelical, a lot of it charismatic, although not all of it was from an evangelical charismatic perspective. And so I got this idea of looking at spiritual gifts as a universal human phenomenon, something that we can all experience, that we can all participate in. And what we believe at a level of doctrine is insignificant to that, not really relevant to that. So we looked last week at speaking in tongues and showed how speaking in tongues is not something that's exclusive to Christianity, exclusive to 20th or 21st century Christianity, but that it's a phenomenon that has been experienced in all kinds of different spiritual contexts, exclusively in spiritual contexts, but something that is evident in ancient shamanism, indigenous shamanism, even today, certain forms of African spirituality as well. And also, it predated the Pentecostal renewal and revival of the 20th century, if you know anything about that. And looked at prophecy a little bit. I want to look at it a little bit more. If you go to my Facebook page and you look at the pinned post on the Facebook page, you'll discover that on Saturday, I'll be hosting a special event by way of Zoom where I'm going to be sharing, and this is, I don't know, bold or reckless or foolish, I don't know, take your pick, or wise. But I'm going to be sharing a word, what I'm calling a prophetic word for 2026. And that probably seems like a complete about face for people if they followed me through the deconstruction part of the journey. If you've been with me the whole time, it wouldn't seem as unusual because this was something that occasionally I would do as I felt that I had received something. So, one of the problems that I experienced with my spirituality that actually led me to deconstruction, but one of the problems that I experienced was trying to control, if you will, spiritual experiences or the information that was received during spiritual experiences to make sure that what I was experiencing and what I was getting was formatted correctly to whatever belief system I had rationally arrived at. In fact, I was taught from the very beginning of my spiritual life, my experience with spirituality back when I was 18, 19 years old, and all the way through until I was about 45 years old, that our experiences are always subject to scripture or always subject to whatever doctrines it was that the group believed. Those were the controls that were set in place to make sure that things didn't get off track, to make sure that we didn't shipwreck our faith or whatever the case may be. And it's interesting to me that all of Christianity, whatever form it takes, whether it's Catholic, evangelical, Eastern Orthodox, progressive, all of Christianity that bases its fundamental belief on the resurrection of Christ promotes the subordination of our personal experiences, whatever those might be, to the doctrinal beliefs that we are given, meaning that Christianity teaches that Jesus is separate from all other spiritual teachers, from all other men, that the proof of his divinity and deity is that he raised from the dead on the third day. So crucified 3 days later, although that's, a little complicated if he died on Friday and rose on Sunday, but nevertheless, after 3 days, rose from the dead and then ascended into heaven where he lives eternally. That goes contrary to any experience that we know about what it means to be human and what it means to die. So we have to subordinate our experience to believe something that was told to us about a historical event that happened 2,000 years ago. So that's the foundation of the whole thing. So when you begin to engage in presence practice and you begin to engage in spirituality, especially relational spirituality, which presupposes that there is an unseen, immaterial spiritual dimension to reality, and that dimension, that world, if you will, that spiritual world, is populated with spirit disincarnate beings, whether they're ancestors or angels or spirit guides, or if you hold to traditional Christianity, angels and demons. And you begin to engage in that realm in a relational sort of way, that's by its very nature experiential. So it can become really problematic when we have to subordinate our experiences from spirit to a form of teaching or doctrine that either can or cannot be substantiated. And so what happens is that as we engage in that realm, if we are committed to dogmas, then we will try to subordinate those experiences to those dogmas. Does that make sense to you? So one of the first things that happened to me a couple times that really shook me up when I was pastoring, and before I had deconstructed, before I had started questioning doctrine, was that I had uh, mediumship type experiences where I remember one particular time I'm just counseling someone as a pastor, not as a counselor, not doing clinical counseling, but pastoral counseling with a person who was not a believer, but had been really struggling with some depression. And as we're talking, this I feel, being sensitive to spiritual things and spiritual energy and intuitive or psychic, suddenly I'm getting a communication from her mother that I did not know had passed on. And really, the root of a lot of her depression was related to issues with her mother. And so, as we're talking, I begin to get this message from her deceased mother. And as I begin to speak and relate what I'm experiencing, what I'm hearing to this person, they were stunned because there were evidential components to it. What I mean by evidential components was there were things that I knew that I had no way of knowing that only her mother would have known, not to mention that I didn't know her mother had passed. Um, but it spoke directly to the issues that she was struggling with and brought tremendous healing to her. And so we both walked out of there like, that was weird. I probably walked out of there like rebuking the devil. What the heck is this? And then sometime later after that, I had another experience in meditation where I'm just engaging uh, presence and meditation, and someone's deceased mother shows up in a vision. Now, in this instance, I knew the person and I knew about their mother being deceased, but I did not know um, the significance of what the message that I was receiving. And I'm receiving this message, and this being in this visionary experience that I'm having is saying, I want you to go to my daughter and tell her these things. I'm like, I'm not about to do that, because unless you give me something where this person will undoubtedly know that it was from her. And I received a picture of a keepsake that was very significant, very, very significant to this person and to the relationship, specifically around when the mother had passed. And so I went to this person and I said, hey, does this particular item mean anything to you? And immediately they closed the doors. Immediately they were upset with me and angry with me, because it hit on a very painful, significant wound that related to the passing of the mom. And the message that I had received in this meditation brought tremendous healing around this issue and to this person. So those are two instances where my dogmas, my doctrines would have said that's off limits, because the Bible forbids communication with the dead. It calls it necromancy, and in the Old Covenant, it was a sin that was worthy of death. Nevertheless, I had these experiences. And if we go even by what Jesus said about we'll know them by their fruits and judge things by its fruit, then I had to look at the fruit in both of these situations, brought tremendous healing and comfort to both of these individuals. And so my point is, I never would have been able to release those things to those individuals, and they would not have been able, at least at that time, to receive the healing that they received had I demanded that my experience with spirit was subordinated to whatever the predominant belief system was that I was adhering to. In fact, real spiritual growth happens when those boxes get broken, when our limitations that are thrust upon us by our belief systems, by the groupthink, by the dogmas around us are limiting us and holding us back. And we have those experiences that invade our lives and break down those limitations and break down those systems and break down those beliefs in order to liberate us into a broader vista of life and healing and spiritual experience. That's how actually spiritual growth happens. So through this process that I've been through of deconstruction and everything that's occurred with me in the last 10 years, I've kind of flipped it. I've kind of flipped the epistemology, the way of knowing how we know something, completely on its head, and began to value personal experience above and beyond whatever my current level of beliefs are, or whatever the group think is that's going on. And so, in the same way that religion is a groupthink, evangelicalism is a groupthink, Catholicism is a groupthink, any religion is oriented around groups that hold to the same values, the same ethics, and the same beliefs. So, religion, by its very nature, deals with the group, right? And has as part of its structure that we don't step outside the party lines, even if our personal experience, our own conscience, our own sense of morality or whatever deviates from that. We pledge our fidelity to the group, to the doctrine, to the tradition, or to the path. That's the very nature of religion. It's group-centered, whereas spirituality is individual-centered, and spirituality is experiential. Well, within the deconstruction community, it can be very much the same way. And we can say, well, because we've left religion, because we've left Jesus, because we've been traumatized by religion, now we have a different groupthink. And the groupthink is it's all toxic, it's all negative. The progression for humanity, the evolution for humanity, the trajectory of the age of Aquarius, if you will, is to throw all of that in the garbage and have nothing to do with it. Well, then what happens when you have experiences that contradict that? Atheism's the same way. We're beholden to atheistic principles of empiricism and naturalism and scientific materialism. And anything that invades our space, any experience that someone might share, or anything that invades that intellectual space is immediately dismissed or explained away or demeaned or mocked or scoffed at or picked on or whatever the case may be, because we're beholden to the group. We're beholden to the philosophy of naturalism. We're beholden to the epistemology of observable, repeatable, measurable, etc., and so on. And so, having deconstructed, having walked away from anything that's prophetic and not liking any of that, it would seem strange for me to come around and say, okay, Saturday, I'm going to give something that I believe is prophetic for 2026. That's a complete deviation. And the only reason I'm doing it is because I received something from Spirit in a dream. And then as I woke from that dream, in a sort of mental download about some things that can help us as we move into 2026 in order to shape a future that is hopefully better for us, less limited, more abundant, and more satisfying than where we're at in the present. So I wake up, I write that down, I receive like this download. Okay, this is the word for 2026. Okay, that could just be for me personally. But it wasn't like I was like, oh, I've got to come up with something for 2026, which is what a lot of people do in the church. It's something that was given to me by Spirit. And I believe that if it was given to me, that it wasn't just for me. And it's too good not to share. So I'll be sharing that if you're interested in that. Like I said, that link's pinned at the top of my Facebook page. And so, naturally, I want to talk a little bit about prophecy and some of this stuff. And I'm using scripture because it's an accessible means of looking at and talking about these things that hopefully a lot of people that watch this are familiar with. But I realize there are some that are not as into that were never really into religion much, don't know much about the Bible. And I think that's okay too. I'm not saying that this is authoritative, that this is the word of God and this is how it is. I'm just saying that if we're going to talk about spiritual gifts, this provides us with accessible material to help us understand and get our mind around it that many of us can relate to, versus just sharing experiences and talking about them out of my own personal experience. So I do think there's a balance between our experiences and experiential knowing and honoring the community and where the community is at as well. So I'm not saying that we always go with our experiences and to hell with what anybody else says or what anybody else thinks. But at the same time, I'm also saying that we can't always subordinate our experience to the group either. So we have to be able to find the balance. Hopefully, I don't know, as I get older and hopefully more mature and a little bit wiser, I'm beginning to discover that we have a tendency to want to do these either or, think in these either or categories, these true false categories. And I'm discovering that the broader perspective is inclusive. It's not usually an either or, but it's an and both. And the trick is to find the balance between those things. So having said that, let's just jump into this because I want to connect some things for you. And I want to look at Acts chapter 2, which is where I started last week. And I'll bring something out in this that maybe a lot of people haven't talked about. So Acts chapter 2 is the day of Pentecost. It's when the Holy Spirit was given to the early church. It says, when the day of Pentecost had fully come, which was a Jewish holiday, still is a Jewish holiday, although they don't call it Pentecost. Pentecost simply means 50 days, so it's 50 days after the Passover. And so when the day of Pentecost had fully come, they were all in one accord and in one place. And suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. And there appeared unto them divided tongues as of fire, and one sat upon each of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. And there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And when this sound occurred, the multitude came together and were confused because everyone heard them speak in his own language. And they were all amazed and marveled and said, look, are not all these who speak Galileans? How is it then that we hear them in the language in which we were born? And then it lists some of the places that they were from. Then in verse 13, it says, others mocking said, they are full of new wine. I think that's significant. I'll come back to that in a minute, but I want you to see they're mocking. They're exhibiting behavior of someone who's intoxicated, logically, or they wouldn't be able to say they're drunk with wine. And then Peter, standing up with the 11, raised his voice and said, men of Judea and all who dwell in Jerusalem, let this be known to you and heed my words, for these are not drunk as you suppose, for it is only the third hour of the day, or 9 o'clock in the morning. But this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. Them speaking in tongues, you hearing them in their own language. This was prophesied in the Old Testament by the prophet Joel centuries ago. And he quotes from the book of Joel. It shall come to pass in the last days, says God, that I will pour out of my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. And on my men servants and on my maid servants I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they shall prophesy. And I will show signs and wonders, etc., and so on. And all who call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. So the fact that they are speaking these languages and everybody's hearing them in their own language triggers something in Peter to remember the promise that in the last days, the Spirit would be poured out on all flesh. And so he's saying their ability to speak your language without ever hearing it, I'm learning it, and you hearing them speak in your own language is evidence that the Spirit's been poured out on all flesh. And as a result of the Spirit being poured out on all flesh, there's also the characteristics of being drunk. In other words, what he's saying is they're not drunk on new wine because it's only 9 o'clock in the morning. These are not drunk as you suppose, even though they're exhibiting aspects and characteristics of drunkenness. They're not drunk as you suppose. This thing that you're calling drunkenness is the outpouring of the Spirit upon all flesh and the fulfillment of Joel's prophecy. And the prophecy is that when the Spirit's poured out, that your sons and daughters will prophesy, that your old men will dream dreams, and that your young men will see visions, that on the men servants and the maid servants shall prophesy. And so the sign that the Spirit was poured out at Pentecost was not speaking in an ecstatic tongue or glossolalia like we talked about last week. It is this ability to prophesy. So I want to look at how these things are connected. I want to look at the fact that they thought that they were drunk, and Peter has to defend it and say, these are not drunk as you suppose, but this is that which was spoken, that the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. I want to tie that to altered states of consciousness, states of ecstasy, and coming under the influence of something. And then I want to connect that to intuitive ways of knowing, although intuitive isn't the best word, I don't think. Noetic, noesis is probably the more accurate term. The noetic ways of knowing, but the intuitive ways of knowing, dreams, visions, the subjective ways of knowing. So we have states of ecstasy, drunkenness with new wine. We have subjective ways of knowing, visions and dreams. And then we have divine communication or prophecy, and this being available to everyone, this being poured out on all flesh. So these are all spiritual gifts. These states of ecstasy, dreams, visions, and divine communications are all gifts that come with the intersection of divine spirit and human consciousness. And so I want to talk about these realities. And again, this is nothing that's new to the Bible. In case you haven't seen the rest of the series and you're just tuning in, this is something that was well known in the ancient world. Plato, Socrates talk about the divine madness, divine ecstasy being one of them. Ritual madness, it was called, which was a reference to the Dionysian cults. So the rituals to Dionysus involved states of ecstasy, altered states of consciousness. They were chaotic and emotional. They often involved wine. Oftentimes in these experiences of the ancient world, there was various different kinds of sacred sexuality or ritual sexuality that was happening. They even had temples where this stuff occurred in the ancient world. But we also see this in, again, African religions and spirituality, these types of just states of ecstasy and altered states of consciousness. I've mentioned Vodun, shamanic rituals, shamanic drumming, shamanic traveling, spirit traveling involves these altered states of consciousness and often states of ecstasy. Glossolalia, speaking in tongues that are not earthly languages, but sort of just rhythmic articulation of sound that doesn't match the known language, is seen in these various different traditions as well. So this is not something that's unique to Christian spiritual expressions, but it is something that's unique to spirituality and spiritual expressions. In other words, we don't see it too many other places, although we probably see it to some degree in music, in dancing, in theater, and in the arts and that kind of stuff. Which brings me to Friedrich Nietzsche and our problem as Western people. So Nietzsche wrote a book called The Birth of Tragedy, and he looks at Greek tragedy, Greek theater, ancient Greek theater, which were known as tragedies, which incidentally, the Greek word for tragedy means the goat song, and it was connected to harvest rituals. Don't really want to go into that too much, but I don't want you to think about tragedy from the standpoint of something tragic and terrible happened, but something that's more rooted in ancient forms of spirituality. And that's how Nietzsche kind of looks at this. And I think he has a fascinating insight here, not just into Greek theater and tragedies, but also religion as it's expressed and experienced, but very much so spirituality and the polarity of our nature that relates to where we are today in the modern world, particularly the modern Western world. Okay, Aaron, what'd you just say? You just said a mouthful. What'd you say? All right. So he breaks down tragedies into a polarity, into a human polarity that he observes, that on the one end, he calls Dionysian, and on the other end, Apollonian, relating to two Greek gods and different types of religious or artistic, in this case, expression. Dionysus was the god of fertility, wine, and chaos. And Dionysus had his cults. Their rituals, their gatherings were emotional, ecstatic, drunken, very connected with nature, with the forces of nature, with the embodiment of the chaotic nature of nature. On the other end, you have the god Apollo, who's the sun god. And Apollo, being the god completely opposite of that, the god of rationalism, rationality, social order, structure, and social persona. So on the one side, you have Dionysus, which might relate in Jungian terms to the shadow. And on the other end, you have Apollo, the sun god, which relates to our social personas, or the masks that we wear, even to ourselves, that cover and hide the shadow parts of ourselves. And he explains this as a polarity. And he says that there's a tension and a balance between the ecstatic, chaotic nature of Dionysian rituals and the structured, ordered, rational approach of the Apollo priesthoods, etc. And then he goes further and he says these things are in conflict with one another, that these polarities end up in our own psyche and in society in conflict with one another. And that when things become too emotional, when they become too ecstatic, when they become too subjective, too much about the inner environment and the individual, the Apollo side of this polarity seeks to subdue that and seeks to control it, if not completely eradicate it, or seeks to suppress it because it's seen as a threat to social order. It's a threat to rationalism. It's a threat to reason. It's a threat to society. So we need to, if not control it, stamp it out, all of that under this umbrella of suppression. At the same time, when something is too structured, when it's too rational, when it's too controlled, when the natural Dionysian ecstatic spiritual side is too suppressed, it will rebel and oftentimes break out, spontaneously erupt, often in ways that aren't necessarily healthy or productive or helpful. We see this in the Victorian era for sure. There's a reason that the theories of Sigmund Freud specifically centered on not just sexuality, but taboo forms of sexuality, because he's a voice in the Victorian era, and all of his patients are suffering from neuroses because of this suppression of this natural side of what it means to be human. And when there's that suppression, then there is oftentimes disruption or perversion that takes place. And so there's this conflict or this war between the two. Now, how does this relate to where we are today and to spirituality? The Apollo side of this, again, refers to rationalism and what can be seen, because Apollo is the sun god, right? So this also relates to observation or to empiricism, or really to modern secularism, modern naturalism, modern scientific materialism, which has philosophical underpinnings and philosophical assumptions about the nature of the world in order for it to work as a system. And the two philosophical underpinnings of it are rationalism, particularly Cartesian rationalism that goes back to René Descartes, and this separation between the observer and that which is observed, and empiricism, which goes back to Sir Francis Bacon, Sir Isaac Newton, definitely to John Locke and David Hume, who really laid the philosophical foundations for the scientific method and for enlightenment. And one of the byproducts of enlightenment was this thing that Nietzsche observed, where the Apollonian completely suppresses, demonizes or mocks the Dionysian or the ecstatic, prophetic, noetic, or intuitive ways of knowing. So let me make this simpler for you. So essentially what happened in enlightenment was it said the best way to know truth and the nature of reality is through rational inquiry and empirical study. In other words, the assumption, the presupposition is that reality is out there completely separate from the observer, completely separate from the mind. Whatever is out there, whatever can be understood, whatever can be known that's out there that is reality, functions and operates the way it is, whether there is an observer present or not. Completely. So to know the nature of reality, to understand nature, to understand its laws, and by understanding its laws, to thereby be able to transcend or overcome or override those laws, we have to be able to study it as it is out there by making observations, by making measurements, by letting it do what it does, and then observing what it does without tainting the process through our own subjective ideas and experiences. Not that much different than what I was talking about at the beginning of this talk, when I was talking about the mediumship aspects and things that we experience spiritually that contradict what we believe, because we'll distort it or we'll try to format it to fit what we think it should be, right? So I could, when I was talking about, receiving something for 2026, I could just totally put that in the garbage can and say, I don't believe in that anymore. And then I'd be subordinating my experience to my current level of belief. And we tend to do that. And so the scientific method is designed, good scientific studies are designed to negate the bias of the observer, but the philosophical assumption is that the observer is not a participant in the nature of reality. It can only observe and seek to understand natural law, the nature of nature, the nature of reality. Now, as a byproduct of this, David Hume, John Locke, these early philosophers, these early ideas, suppressed ecstatic, mystical, religious experience, calling it emotionalism, and somehow emotionalism is bad. Emotionalism takes you away from a sound mind. It takes you away from reality. That's a presupposition that's built in. So it's just emotionalism. It's all subjectivity. And because the observer is completely separate from reality, and the only means of knowing truth accurately is through sensory experience, empiricism, seeing, hearing, feeling, etc., then all this other stuff is just nonsense. And so the intuitive ways of knowing, or again, the noetic ways of knowing, the internal ways of dreams, visions, downloads, spiritual experiences, receiving knowledge, mediumship, spiritism, divination, all of these things are completely unreliable and have no worth or value whatsoever. The only thing that we can know, the only thing that can be true is what's observable, what's measurable, what's repeatable, what fits within the presuppositions and assumptions of philosophical naturalism and philosophical materialism, the ideas of enlightenment. So again, we get stuck in this either or category. It's either has to be naturalism and all this other stuff doesn't fit with this worldview, so therefore it becomes excluded, it becomes suppressed, and anytime it raises its head, whether it is paranormal experiments with ESP, experiments with precognition, knowing the future before it happens, these things have been studied rigorously scientifically. Channeling has been studied rigorously scientifically. The benefits of spirituality has been subjected to rigorous scientific studies, but they don't get the funding and they don't get the prominence in our schools to be taught as reliable, even though the science itself is reliable, because it is that Dionysian side of life creeping up on the Apollo's side, the Apollonian side, that is ruling and dominating the age in which we live. The problem is it can't be suppressed. And so let's just define some terms real quick. Prophetic utterance. What is prophetic utterance? What is prophecy? So R.E.A. Kaplan, a Jewish rabbi, wrote a book called Meditation in the Bible, and he goes into the Hebraic roots of the word prophet, Nabi, I think I'm saying that right. And it initially means not to speak forth as an utterance or speech or related to speech or language. It simply means to act as a channel for spiritual power, to act as a channel for spiritual power. So a prophet, in the biblical sense, was a person who was open to spiritual power, open to spiritual energy, and then able to channel that to meet whatever the need may be. So speaking forth the mind of God, or the speaking forth the mind of the Spirit, was an aspect of prophecy that we turned into the whole of it today when we talk about it. Because anything you look at on prophecy is going to be about speaking. But according to Kaplan, in the original ancient sense, it meant the ability to channel, yes, information, but also power for healing, power for miracles, things of this nature. So to be a prophet is to be a channel, and a lot of what is called channeling today is prophetic utterance. So it's channeling. And then when it comes to the means, the medium, the means, the tools, the instruments, the methods, the language through which these things come, it's often related to clairvoyance or to dreams and to visions. Dreams and visions. Or what we would call the noetic ways of knowing. Now, what does this have to do with states of ecstasy? What does this have to do with new wine? Opening to spiritual presence, opening to spiritual relationship, opening to relationship with God or the divine, requires a different state of consciousness that is not the same as normal waking sensory perception. It is a shift in consciousness. It is an altered state. Oftentimes, these altered states will take on these Dionysian forms of which Nietzsche was speaking about in The Birth of Tragedy. Wild, ecstatic, drunken types of states. Not always. Shamanic journeying, where a person listens to drumming and travels in the mind, travels in consciousness, travels in the imagination, or as the shaman would say, travels in spirit, in visionary experience to the upper world or the middle world or the lower world. These are all altered states of consciousness. The use of plant medicine like psilocybin or ayahuasca alters the state of consciousness and opens the consciousness to perceptions and visions, things of this nature. Modern stuff that's weighed heavily towards naturalism, that's weighed heavily towards the Apollonian side of things, that's weighed heavily towards the scientific model, would call it hallucinations, maybe even psychosis, emotionalism, power of suggestion. But these are very human characteristics. And oftentimes opening to spirit and altering the state of consciousness in a way to be open to prophetic insight, to be open to these things, requires an altered state of consciousness that oftentimes takes on a wild or ecstatic or drunken state of being. That does not mean that it does not have value. If we say it doesn't have any value, if we say it's not a means to truth, it's not a means to accurate information, it's not a means to information or wisdom can enhance and improve your life, it's not opening to channel energy and power in a situation that can bring about radical transformation and even healing and even the miraculous, we're cutting ourselves off completely from those resources. I want to give a shout out to my friend Tiana Galgano, who in the last year has introduced me to dream work. And one of the reasons I used to just refer to all this as the intuitive ways of knowing, but Tiana has a phenomenal teaching on intuition that has shifted the way I think about intuition. And so I use the term noetic, noesis, inward ways of knowing from dreams and visions and downloads, all the clairvoyance, claircognizance, clairsentience, all that. I talked about that, I think, in the first teaching in this series. Which she opened me up to dream work. And she's written a great book on dreams, Decipher Your Dreams, Decipher Your Life. If you're interested in that, let me know. I'll get you Tiana's information. You can order the book. Please don't go out on Amazon and order it, because you'll be getting like a used copy or something. And it would just be great if Tiana would be properly compensated for her work. So contact me if you're interested in that. But I probably have 120 pages of dream work that I've done in the last year. And I've found my dreams to be, in a lot of ways, my most reliable guide in life. I've had dreams that were precognitive, where I would dream about something and interpret it, and then as the events unfolded, the message in the dream took on a much greater significance. And there's all kinds of things that you can do in dream work that has benefit. I think it's an essential. We spend 1/3 of our lives asleep, and we ignore that means of guidance and that way of knowing that can really be beneficial to us. But I will say it does take a lot of work. It is a practice. It is a skill. It does take knowledge. It does take effort. It does take guidance to do that. So I understand why a lot of people don't do that. But I'm grateful to Tiana. I'm grateful to the dreamer inside of me. I'm grateful to the messages and the things that I've received from dreams. And prior to that, visions. But what I want to do in this last little bit is expand your thinking about spiritual gifting, in that it doesn't have to be regulated to just what we can rationally, like, give rational meaning to, that's just over here on the Apollonian side. That there can be states of ecstasy, states of almost drunkenness. We experienced this in our church, and I debated about whether or not I should share this, but I'm going to go ahead and share this. So, 2008, we had a um, incredible, what we just called back then, visitation that swept through our church, of just intense divine spirit activity that was happening and taking place. And one of the things that, if you're familiar with the Toronto blessing, those of you that are part of my Christian audience, that was very Dionysian. Now, I never went to Toronto. I never experienced anything related to that. I never went to the meetings in Pensacola. Was never in a Rodney Howard Brown meeting. But we certainly, very early on, even before those movements had started, when we started a prayer group, when I was, I don't know, 19, 20 years old, with my sister, uh, at my sister's house with a group of young people, we would experience these, we would just enter into spiritual engagement, and we would experience these altered state of subconsciousness that were akin to intoxication, akin to drunkenness. And in those states, we were open oftentimes more to the miraculous, more to the paranormal than we would have been in just the average daily survival state of consciousness that most of us are stuck in. But we would have these meetings, and they just spontaneously, there was no encouragement, there was no like trickery involved, there was no con artist stuff, there was no, we weren't trying to be like the church up north, we weren't trying to be like Toronto. Like I said, I wasn't influenced by those things, but we had had experiences, because these are ubiquitous experiences for humanity. And when there's too much suppression of the Dionysian, it pops up. And so a church that had become extremely rational, extremely dogmatic, extremely doctrine focused, you would have pockets of renewal or revival where this Dionysian thing, using, again, going back to Nietzsche's model, would raise up and overcome the suppression of those things. And so I remember we would have these meetings where people would just show up and they would just start to laugh. They would just get hit with laughter for hours sometimes. People would be so generally intoxicated by spirit that we would have to drive them home. They wouldn't be able to walk. They'd have to be carried out of meetings or led out of meetings, or they'd have, like I said, we'd have to drive them home. um, uh, States of ecstasy, states of mystical ecstasy. And out of those states of mystical ecstasy came tremendous healings, emotional healings, uh, prophetic utterances about people and about their lives that built them up, that healed them, that delivered them from mental oppressions, that predicted accurately future events with information that was useful and helpful at the time. I remember one particular service, Jeanette Pacheco, still, she usually watches and comments, but she was part of this, where we were in this renewal season, and in the sanctuary at the time where we met, I felt concentrated energy centers. In other words, you're walking through the room and you feel heat, or you feel like an electrical current just in the atmosphere, like standing. I think they were what we would call angels. That's how we understood it back then, for sure. And there was 3 or 4 of these sort of portals that had opened up. And I remember just spontaneously, in this sort of altered state of ecstasy and state of consciousness, taking her by the hand and walking her into one of these arenas. She didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know she needed physical healing at the time. I led her into this vortex of energy, and as soon as she entered into it, she fell on the ground in a state of altered state of consciousness, almost unconsciousness, but not unconscious. We used to call it being slain in the spirit. But didn't push her, didn't suggest it to her, didn't tell her what I was seeing, no power of suggestion, no hypnotic stuff. Just I felt it, sensed it. I felt to go grab her, take her. And when she went into that state, she got up later and she said she felt electrical currents going through her body, electrical currents of energy going through her body. And the issue that she was dealing with in her body at the time that she was struggling with was totally healed in that moment. And we would just have these incredible times. People would just be laying out on the floor. They would have dreams, they would have visions, they would have visitations. And like I said, their lives would improve. We had a number of people during that time that visited the service who were dealing with heavy, uh, severe episodes of depression with suicidal ideations. I can think of one person in particular, uh, completely set free from that in a service. But one story that I like to share was there was a woman, not a religious woman, but I was friends with her son from high school, and she was going through a severe bout of chronic depression, and she was uh, thinking of unaliving herself, and she had made up her mind she was going to do it that morning, and she thought, well, before I do that, I'm going to go to Aaron's church and see if God has something for me, or see if I can find any reason to not follow through with her intentions and her ideations. So she goes to the service and nothing really happens for her. But it was enough, whatever she heard, whatever she experienced that day was enough to make her put it off. Not to make her change her mind, but just to make her put it off. Because she had decided if she didn't get something in that service, that she was going to, after the service, complete her intentions to unalive herself. So she goes home, she puts it off, she decides to go home, and she had been visiting, first time visitor. Again, not someone that was churched, not someone that believed in Jesus, just someone desperate, looking for hope. And she comes. We were having prayer meetings on Thursday nights, revival meetings on Thursday nights. So she comes again on Thursday night. We had a smaller group. We were just doing some things in prayer and whatever. She sits with the group and she says, I'm going to tell you the story. She tells us the story that she had been struggling with severe depression, that she was struggling with suicidal ideation. The story I just told you, she tells us. And then she says, I went home, and one of the things that we would do for first-time visitors, if they filled out a visitor card, is we would deliver a gift, a package, cookies, something. I don't remember what it was, but we had people, lovely people, that would take and welcome people and thank them for coming and let them know we'd love to have you back to church, etc. And so whatever family was taking them that day, she said when they brought the gift and she received the gift, she said she felt a wave of power come over her being. And she said it instantly broke the oppression, broke the depression, broke the suicidal ideations. And she started to laugh, and she started to experience joy. She started to experience ecstasy. And so she came on Thursday to tell us about this experience that she had simply because someone brought a gift, connected with presence, connected with her, and stayed in connection with her for months, not, I think a couple of years after that, and never had another bout of depression. So that's prophetic. What happened? That whatever was channeled from presence met the need for Jeanette, right? For healing. Whatever was channeled from presence met the need for this person to deliver them emotionally, mentally, set them free. All of this came from these incredible times and these incredible meetings that we were having and experiencing as we were coming together, opening to presence, opening to relational spirituality, right? Not focused on the doctrine, not focused on the teaching, not coming to hear a message, coming to have communion, true communion, not just the Eucharist. that's really the nature. So when we're talking about the prophetic, we're talking about spiritual gifts. We're talking about those are spiritual gifts. They may not be listed in scripture. They may not be in the books on psychic abilities or developing your intuitions, whatever the case may be. But spiritual gifts, nevertheless, that brought about tremendous benefit and tremendous good and tremendous blessing. But if we shut that down and we're not open to that because, it's just emotionalism, that's just fanaticism, can't trust intuition, can't trust the noetic ways of knowing, can't trust dreams or visions or clairsentience or clairaudience, claircognizance, can't trust those downloads that you receive, then we're cutting ourselves off from the intersection of spirit and circumstance, spirit and matter, or really we're denying ourselves what it means to be human. And we're denying ourselves access to resources that can be incredibly powerful, that can be incredibly life-changing. And it begins with openness. It begins with openness. It begins with intention. It begins with engagement. It begins by honoring and valuing. So when I talked about the dream work, one of the things I learned from Tiana was to honor my dreams, to listen to my dreams, to take the time to write them down, to take the time to decipher them, and then decipher what's happening in my life as a result of that. It's been incredibly life-changing. I'm so grateful and thankful for it. I'm looking forward to the future because of that. Doesn't mean we always hit it right. Doesn't mean everything that we get is from purely from spirit. But think about what we close ourselves off to, because we have to deconstruct. We have to, religion is the root of all evil. We cut ourselves off from spirit. We cut ourselves off from presence. We cut ourselves off from spirituality. We cut ourselves off from being part of a spiritual community that can provide for us surprises and gifts that can edify us, that can build us up, that can change our lives, that can set us free, that can heal us, that can heal our lives mentally, emotionally, relationally, and physically. So that's why I think it's important to talk about relational spirituality. That's why I think it's important to revive spiritual gifts and to let you know you can leave the toxic dogma. You can leave the aspects of it that don't fit and don't work. You don't have to subordinate your spiritual life to the group or to the patterns of this world. And you can learn to nurture and develop this side, and it's okay to let that side out. It's okay to be a little fanatical. It's okay to be emotional. It's okay to be intoxicated in spirit. It's okay to tap into the wild side of life, if you will, the chaotic side, the less controlled side of life. We live lives that are way too controlled, way too focused on control, which even from a scientific or naturalist perspective would be impossible, because there's too many factors, too many random factors going on in life to control them to begin with. So anyway, my hour's up. I hope this was helpful for you. I hope this was a blessing for you. I just want to speak life to you today, speak life into your new year, speak abundance and joy, and just a release of spiritual life and presence and power into your life. And I hope that you will have a very, very blessed day, evening, morning, night, whatever time it is that you're watching this. Thank you for spending your time with me. Thank you for joining me for this. And I will be back with you again. Hopefully, if you're part of the New Day Global Group, if you're not, you can get into the Facebook New Day Global Group and join that. I'm hoping, because I'm off this week, to be able to do a couple more teachings exclusively for that group along these lines, talking more about like how to receive this stuff, how to walk in this stuff, how to apply this stuff to your life. So anyway, once again, Sharon Tomlinson, thank you so much. And I will see you again here, if you join me on Sundays next week for Sunday Morning Live.